Sometimes a man rides into town looking for a horse, only to discover that fate has been waiting for him far longer than he has been searching for it. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe that true courage is measured by compassion rather than force, take a moment to like and follow. Now, back to the story. The morning sun had barely climbed above the distant mesas when Ethan Walker guided his bay gelding toward the frontier town of Red Creek. Dust drifted lazily across the road, catching the golden light like tiny sparks floating through still air. The autumn wind carried the scent of dry sagebrush, worn leather, and horses that had traveled farther than most men ever would. Ethan had only one purpose. Winter would arrive sooner than expected, and his aging ranch needed a younger, stronger horse before the cattle drive began. It sounded like a simple errand, the sort of task a rancher completed every few years without giving it much thought. Yet the closer he rode to town, the more he noticed something unusual. Red Creek was busier than usual. Wagons lined the main street. Cowboys leaned against wooden posts outside the saloon. Ranchers inspected saddles, ropes, and livestock while merchants shouted prices across the crowded marketplace. It was horse auction day, and people had traveled for miles hoping to find the finest animal west of the Pecos. Everywhere Ethan looked, someone was smiling over a successful bargain. Everyone except those standing near the last corral. Unlike the lively noise surrounding the auction grounds, the final pin rested beneath an uncomfortable silence. People glanced toward it, whispered a few words, then deliberately turned away. Some even crossed the street rather than walk beside it. Ethan followed their eyes. Inside stood a single woman. She wore a simple buckskin dress faded by years beneath the desert sun. Her long black braid rested over one shoulder, decorated with only a few worn beads that caught the morning light. Her posture remained straight despite obvious exhaustion, and her quiet dignity seemed strangely untouched by the judgment surrounding her. Beside her stood a tall gray horse with an unusually calm expression, its ears alert but relaxed, as though it understood every word spoken beyond the fence. An old rancher beside Ethan removed his hat and muttered quietly, "Best leave that one alone." Ethan looked toward him. "Why?" The man hesitated before answering. "She's Apache." Nothing more followed. No explanation. No warning beyond that single word. As Ethan continued watching, another buyer approached the pen. For a brief moment, it seemed he might ask about the horse. Instead, after noticing the woman waiting silently beside it, he shook his head, turned around, and walked away without saying a single sentence. Others repeated the same ritual. Curious eyes, whispered voices, quiet retreat. The woman never called after them. She simply rested one weathered hand against the horse's neck and waited. There was something in her expression Ethan could not ignore. It was not desperation. It was not anger. It was the look of someone who had already grown accustomed to disappointment yet refused to surrender her dignity to it. The gray horse gently lowered its head toward her shoulder. For the first time that morning, Ethan forgot he had come looking for the strongest horse in town. Instead, he found himself wondering why the only horse no one wanted seemed to be standing beside the only person carrying herself with genuine honor. No one in Red Creek spoke the widow's name above a whisper, as though kindness itself had become something dangerous. Ethan remained beside the weathered fence long after the other buyers drifted away. The gray horse stood perfectly still, its silver coat carrying the dust of countless trails, while the woman gently brushed loose strands of its mane with slow, practiced movements. She neither begged for attention nor pleaded for a sale. She simply waited with the quiet patience of someone who had already survived losses far greater than poverty. The auctioneer rang his brass bell once more. "Next horse," he shouted. Voices immediately gathered around a pair of glossy stallions on the opposite side of the yard. Laughter echoed between the wooden buildings as bidding climbed higher with every raised hand. The lively crowd barely spared another glance toward the lonely corner where the Apache widow remained standing. Ethan watched the contrast in silence. Prosperity attracted noise. Dignity endured silence. An elderly blacksmith stepped beside him, wiping soot from his rough hands onto a leather apron. "You planning on buying?" the old man asked. "I haven't decided." The blacksmith followed Ethan's gaze toward the gray horse before lowering his voice. "Best not to. Because she's Apache? The old man sighed. Because folks around here remember old wars longer than old favors. His words lingered in the cool morning air. Ethan had spent enough years crossing open country to know that stories often changed depending on who was telling them. Fear had a habit of growing larger each time it was repeated. Across the corral, two ranchers approached the widow together. For an instant, hope flickered across the horse trader's face. One of them circled the gray horse, checking its legs with experienced eyes. Strong shoulders, he admitted. The lungs are healthy, the other added. The widow finally spoke. His name is Ash. Her voice was calm and steady, carrying neither apology nor pride. He was raised by my husband. The first rancher froze. Your husband? He was Apache. Silence settled immediately. The men exchanged uneasy glances before stepping backward almost in perfect unison. Without another word, they walked away. Ash lifted his head, watching them leave. The widow simply rested her palm against his neck again, saying nothing. Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. Not because the sale had failed, because rejection had arrived so quickly, so effortlessly, as though it required no thought at all. He finally crossed the dusty yard. Every pair of eyes seemed to follow him. The conversations nearby grew quieter. Even the auctioneer paused for a moment. When Ethan reached the fence, the widow looked up for the first time. Her deep brown eyes revealed exhaustion beyond sleepless nights. They carried years of loneliness, quiet endurance, and a determination that refused to disappear. Neither of them spoke immediately. The wind moved softly through the cottonwood trees behind the auction yard, carrying dry leaves across the packed earth. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. How old is he? The widow glanced toward the horse before answering. 7 winters. And healthy. He has carried everything my family owned. She hesitated only briefly. He has never abandoned anyone. Ethan reached through the fence, allowing Ash to approach first. The gray horse stepped forward without fear, lowered its nose into his open hand, and breathed slowly against his weathered palm. A horse could not understand prejudice. It only understood the character of the hands that touched it. For reasons Ethan could not yet explain, buying a horse no longer felt like the purpose that had brought him to Red Creek. It felt like the beginning of something neither he nor the quiet Apache widow had expected. Sometimes the smallest decision costs exactly what it is worth, yet changes far more than anyone could ever afford to lose. Ethan kept his hand resting against Ash's warm neck while the noise of the auction faded behind him. The gray horse remained calm, breathing steadily as though the crowded yard no longer existed. Naya watched the quiet exchange without interrupting. She had seen hundreds of strangers inspect the horse with experienced eyes, but none had taken the time simply to let the animal decide whether trust should be given. You still wish to know the price? She asked. Ethan nodded. Name it. There was no hesitation in her answer. $120. It was a fair price, perhaps even lower than the horse deserved. Several nearby ranchers laughed openly after hearing the number. He's paying full price for an Apache horse, one of them muttered. Must have more money than sense, another replied. Their words drifted across the dusty yard like dry leaves pushed by an indifferent wind. Ethan ignored every one of them. He looked again at Ash. There were old scars beneath the silver coat, nearly hidden by years of healing. The horse carried itself with unusual balance despite countless miles traveled across unforgiving country. Strong legs, clear eyes, calm breathing, nothing about. The animal suggested weakness. If anything, Ash possessed the quiet confidence found only in creatures that had survived hardship without surrendering their spirit. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his worn canvas coat and removed a weathered leather wallet. The bills were folded carefully, saved through months of repairing fences, driving cattle, and sleeping beneath open skies instead of paying for a room. Every dollar represented another sunrise spent working beneath relentless heat. He counted the money slowly. 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. Then the final 20. Without bargaining. Without asking for a lower price. He extended the folded bills toward Naya. This belongs to you. She stared at the money but made no effort to take it. Most buyers argued. Most searched for flaws. Most tried to profit from another person's desperation. This man simply offered exactly what she had asked. Finally, she accepted the payment with both hands, almost as though she feared it might disappear if she moved too quickly. Thank you, she whispered. The words were barely louder than the wind. Ethan smiled gently. No. He glanced toward Ash. I think he's worth more. For the first time since sunrise, something changed in Naya's expression. Not relief. Not happiness. Hope. Small. Fragile. But unmistakably real. She reached beneath the collar of her buckskin dress and removed a narrow strip of braided rawhide. Attached to it hung a tiny silver charm worn smooth by years of handling. My husband tied this to Ash the day he finished training him, she said quietly. It reminds him where home is. She hesitated before fastening the braid beneath the horse's mane. I cannot ask you to keep it. Ethan shook his head. If it belongs with him, it stays. Their eyes met again. Neither realized that several men across the yard had been watching every moment of the sale. One of them, dressed in an expensive black riding coat, narrowed his eyes before quietly speaking to the man beside him. So the cowboy bought the gray one. The other nodded. Should we tell Mr. Barrett? The man glanced once more toward Ash. I think we'd better. Neither Ethan nor Naya heard the conversation. They were too busy leading the gray horse toward the open gate, unaware that what had seemed like an ordinary purchase had just become the first move in a far larger game, one that had never been about buying a horse at all. The road home seemed peaceful, but the quietest trails often carried the footsteps of trouble long before anyone could hear them. Ethan left Red Creek with two horses walking side by side beneath the warm afternoon sun. His faithful bay gelding carried his saddle as always, while Ash followed beside him without a rope, guided only by calm words and an occasional glance. That alone surprised Ethan. Most horses needed firm hands before trusting a stranger. Ash walked as though he had already made his own decision. Behind them, the sounds of the auction slowly disappeared. Ahead stretched miles of open prairie where tall grass swayed beneath a steady breeze, broken only by scattered cottonwoods and distant sandstone ridges glowing amber beneath the western light. For nearly an hour, neither Ethan nor Ash hurried. The silence felt honest. Then hoofbeats echoed behind them. Ethan turned. Naya was riding a small chestnut mare, keeping a respectful distance before gently urging the animal closer. I hope I'm not troubling you, she said. You aren't. She glanced toward Ash. I forgot to tell you something. Ethan stopped both horses beside a shallow creek where clear water flowed lazily around smooth stones polished by countless seasons. Naya dismounted first. Ash immediately lifted his head. Instead of walking toward Ethan, the gray horse crossed directly to her. She smiled faintly and rubbed the broad forehead between his ears. He always checks on family first. Ethan watched quietly. Looks like I still have some earning to do. For the first time, a soft laugh escaped her lips. It was brief, almost uncertain, as though laughter itself had become unfamiliar. The silver braid beneath his mane, she explained. Don't remove it. I wouldn't. My husband believed every horse should remember kindness before commands. She gently untied the braided charm just enough for Ethan to see it more clearly. Inside the leather wrapping rested a tiny feather woven together with faded blue thread. No silver, no jewels. Only careful hands had made it valuable. He braided it the night before he died. The words settled between them like stones sinking into still water. Ethan did not ask how her husband had died. Some stories belonged to the person carrying them. Instead, he asked, was Ash always his? Naya nodded. He raised him from a colt. She looked toward the endless hills beyond the creek. My father bred horses long before the fighting began. You raised many? The finest endurance horses our people ever owned. There was no pride in her voice. Only memory. They could travel farther with less water than most ranch horses. Ethan looked back at Ash with new understanding. The calm strength. The effortless stride. The unusual intelligence. None of it had been an accident. Before either of them spoke again, Ash suddenly stopped drinking. His ears lifted sharply. His entire body became still. Ethan noticed it immediately. What is it? Naya followed the horse's gaze toward the ridge overlooking the creek. For several long seconds she saw nothing. Then sunlight flashed briefly against polished metal. A spyglass. Someone was watching them. The reflection disappeared almost instantly. Ethan narrowed his eyes, but the distant figure had already slipped behind the rocks. Do you know who that was? He asked quietly. Naya's expression lost its warmth. I don't. She hesitated. But no one follows Ash by accident. The afternoon wind carried only the whisper of dry grass across the valley. Somewhere beyond the ridge, another horse turned and disappeared into the fading light. Neither Ethan nor Naya realized that word of the gray horse had already traveled faster than either of them had left town, and somewhere ahead, men with deeper pockets than honest hearts were beginning to ask why an ordinary rancher had paid full price for an animal everyone else had refused. Every great secret leaves footprints long before anyone realizes they have been following them. Ethan decided not to return to his ranch before sunset. Instead, he followed Naya along a narrow trail winding through sandstone bluffs, until they reached a hidden valley where cottonwood trees sheltered a quiet spring. The air felt cooler there. Birds circled above the water, and wildflowers pushed through cracks between weathered stones. It was the kind of place travelers could ride past 100 times without ever knowing it existed. Ash walked ahead with surprising confidence. He did not hesitate. He knew the path. When they reached the spring, the gray horse lowered his head and drank deeply before wandering toward an old wooden corral that had nearly disappeared beneath vines and drifting sand. Ethan stopped. The fence had collapsed years ago, yet its careful construction remained obvious. Heavy cedar posts had once enclosed a much larger pasture than any single family would need. "You built this?" he asked. Naya slowly shook her head. "My father." She rested one hand on the broken gate. "This valley belonged to our horses before it belonged to silence." Ethan looked across the open meadow. Scattered everywhere were small reminders of another life. Rusted horseshoes half buried beneath the earth, weathered hitching rails, empty feed troughs, a faded branding iron lying beside a stone fire pit where ashes had long ago disappeared into the soil. "How many horses?" Naya stared across the valley before answering. "Almost 200. Ethan turned toward her. 200. She nodded. "My father believed a horse should survive where men could not." Her voice carried quiet pride wrapped inside old sorrow. He spent decades crossing deserts, trading with ranchers, observing cavalry mounts, learning which bloodlines carried endurance instead of speed. She smiled faintly while watching Ash graze beneath an ancient cottonwood. He never wanted the fastest horses. He wanted the last horses still standing. Ethan understood immediately. Ash was not merely well-trained. He was the result of generations of careful breeding. Suddenly, the unusually calm temperament, the powerful shoulders, the effortless stride across rough country. Everything made sense. "What happened to them?" Ethan asked. The smile disappeared. "When the fighting spread across this territory, soldiers came first." She paused. "Then traitors. Then thieves." One sentence. 3 different losses. The herd was scattered. Some were taken. Some were killed. The rest vanished into ranches that changed their brands. Only Ash remained. "The last one," Ethan whispered. Naya nodded. "My husband spent years hiding him." She gently touched the braided charm beneath Ash's mane. He believed one horse could preserve an entire bloodline. A cold breeze drifted through the valley, although the afternoon remained warm. Ethan suddenly remembered the man watching them from the ridge. "Who besides you knows this?" "I told no one. But someone does." Before she could answer, fresh hoofprints caught Ethan's attention near the edge of the spring. They were large, too fresh to belong to old travelers. He crouched beside them. At least 4 horses, perhaps 5. The tracks pointed toward the valley, then turned back toward Red Creek. Someone had found this hidden place. Someone had already left. Ethan slowly stood. They weren't hunting game. Naya followed the trail with growing concern. "No." She whispered the answer almost to herself. They were looking for Ash. Far beyond the cliffs, where the fading sun painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, a rider urged his horse toward the sprawling Barrett Ranch. Inside his saddlebag rested a rough sketch of the gray horse, and beside it lay a single message written only 4 words long. "Found the last bloodline." Greed rarely announces itself with raised voices. More often, it arrives wearing polished boots and a friendly smile. The following morning, Ethan rode toward his ranch with Ash beside him, while Naya returned to the small cabin she had called home since her husband's passing. Neither of them noticed that another pair of riders had quietly split apart before sunrise. One followed Ethan from a distance. The other disappeared toward the county office in Red Creek. By midday, the wind carried the smell of fresh-cut hay across Ethan's property. Weathered fences stretched toward rolling hills where a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully beneath a cloudless sky. It was not a wealthy ranch, but every board, every gate, and every corral had been built by Ethan's own hands. Honest work left little room for luxury, yet it always left room for pride. Ash stepped through the ranch gate as though he had lived there for years. He studied every corner carefully before settling near the water trough. Ethan smiled. "You'll do just fine here." Before he could remove the saddle from his gelding, the distant sound of approaching horses echoed across the pasture. 3 riders. They did not hurry. Confident men never needed to. Leading them was a broad-shouldered ranch owner dressed in a tailored black coat despite the afternoon heat. His silver belt buckle gleamed beneath the sun, and every movement suggested a man accustomed to being obeyed. He stopped several yards away. "You Ethan Walker?" "I am." The stranger tipped his hat slightly. "Silas Barrett." The name needed no introduction. Barrett owned more land than anyone within 50 miles. He also owned the loyalty of men who preferred money over conscience. His eyes settled immediately on Ash. "So that's the gray." Ethan remained calm. "What about him? I hear you bought him yesterday." "I did." Barrett smiled politely. "I'll save us both some time." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a thick leather pouch. $500. It was more than 4 times what Ethan had paid. "I'll take the horse." The ranch fell silent. Even the breeze seemed to hesitate. Ethan looked at the pouch before shaking his head. "He's not for sale." Barrett chuckled as though he had expected resistance. $8,000. Still Ethan refused. "I already answered." One of Barrett's hired men leaned forward. "You'd be a fool to turn that down." Ethan met his eyes without anger. "Maybe, but he'd still be my fool to be." Barrett's smile slowly faded. He dismounted and walked toward Ash, studying the horse with practiced attention. He examined the powerful shoulders, the steady breathing, the silver braid hidden beneath the mane. Recognition flashed across his face. So the stories were true. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "What stories?" Barrett ignored the question. Instead, he spoke quietly enough that only Ethan could hear. "That horse doesn't belong on a small ranch. It belongs to whoever earned him." Barrett's expression hardened. "No, it belongs to history." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Barrett adjusted his gloves and stepped back. "You'll change your mind." "I won't. We'll see." He climbed back into the saddle before giving one last glance toward Ash. "I'd keep a close eye on him tonight." The 3 riders turned their horses and disappeared beneath a rising cloud of prairie dust. Only after they were gone did Ethan notice something lying in the dirt where Barrett had been standing. A folded document. He picked it up slowly. Across the top, stamped in bold black ink, were the words, "Property Claim Authorization." The space describing the horse remained blank. The signature line, however, already bore the name of the county sheriff. For the first time since leaving Red Creek, Ethan understood that Barrett had never intended to buy Ash. The offer had merely been the polite way of asking. What came next would not be nearly as courteous. Truth has a way of arriving without hurry, and when it finally stands in the open, every lie suddenly looks exhausted. Before dawn the next morning, heavy knocks echoed across Ethan's ranch house. He opened the door to find Sheriff Wallace standing on the porch beside 2 deputies, their hats damp with morning dew and their expressions carefully guarded. A folded document rested in the sheriff's hand. Behind them, Barrett's riders waited quietly at the gate. "Morning, Ethan," the sheriff said. "I wish it were." "So do I." He unfolded the paper. "I've received a property claim concerning the gray horse." Ethan studied the sheriff's face rather than the document. "You believe it?" "I don't know what I believe." "Then why are you here?" "Because the law says I have to ask." Ethan stepped aside. "Come see the horse." The sheriff walked into the pasture where Ash stood peacefully beneath an old oak tree. The gray stallion looked up only briefly before returning to his hay. There was no sign of fear, only quiet confidence. Barrett arrived moments later, smiling as though the outcome had already been decided. "I appreciate your cooperation, Sheriff." Wallace gave a short nod but remained silent. Barrett approached Ash with practiced ease. "This horse belongs to property once managed by my family." Naya's voice interrupted him. "No." Everyone turned. She had ridden through the gate before sunrise, her chestnut mare breathing hard from the long journey. Dust covered her buckskin dress, yet she climbed down without hesitation. That horse never belonged to you. Barrett laughed softly. Can you prove it? Silence lingered. Then Naya reached beneath Ash's silver mane and carefully untied the braided leather charm. She placed it into the sheriff's weathered hands. My husband made this. The sheriff examined it closely. Inside the braid rested not only the faded feather Ethan had already seen, but also a tiny strip of folded buckskin hidden within the wrapping. He carefully unfolded it. A small map appeared, not of land, of bloodlines, names, dates, breeding marks, carefully recorded generations of horses stretching back nearly 30 years. The sheriff frowned. What is this? My father documented every foal. Barrett's confident smile weakened. Naya continued quietly. He believed someone might one day try to steal what could not be replaced. The sheriff compared the symbols on the map with the unusual mark burned lightly beneath Ash's left shoulder. They matched perfectly. One of Barrett's hired men shifted uneasily. Another avoided looking at his employer. Wallace slowly lifted his eyes. This document predates your ranch ownership, Barrett. Barrett answered quickly. Anybody could have written it. Perhaps. The sheriff folded the map carefully. But someone else might remember. At that exact moment, another horse entered the ranch. An elderly man climbed stiffly from the saddle. His beard had turned completely white, and years of blacksmith work had bent his shoulders, yet Ethan recognized him immediately. It was the old blacksmith from Red Creek. I was there, the old man said before anyone could speak. I shod those horses. I settled on him. He looked directly at the sheriff. I remember her father. He pointed gently toward Naya. And I remember Barrett's father buying only wagons, never horses. The silence that followed felt heavier than thunder. Barrett opened his mouth to object. No words came. For years, rumors had spoken louder than witnesses. Now the witness had finally arrived. The sheriff looked from the aging blacksmith to the hidden pedigree, then to Ash standing quietly between Ethan and Naya. He slowly rolled up the false property claim and slipped it into his coat. Without raising his voice, he spoke the only sentence that mattered. It appears this horse has been telling the truth longer than the rest of us have been willing to listen. In the end, no one truly owns a horse. A horse chooses the road, and sometimes it chooses the people worthy of walking beside it. The sheriff folded the hidden pedigree with the care usually reserved for family Bibles and returned it to Naya. Around them, the morning remained perfectly still. Even Barrett's riders seemed uncertain where to rest their eyes. Their employer, who had ridden on to Ethan's ranch expecting another easy victory, now stood surrounded not by enemies, but by undeniable truth. Sheriff Wallace broke the silence. There'll be no seizure. He turned toward Barrett. And there'll be an inquiry into this claim. Barrett's jaw tightened. You'll regret embarrassing me. No, the sheriff answered quietly. I'll regret waiting this long to ask the right questions. One by one, Barrett's hired men lowered their heads. They had followed wealth for years because wealth usually walked ahead of the law. Today, for the first time, it had stopped. Barrett mounted his horse without another word. He pulled sharply on the reins and rode away across the pasture, his men following behind him. The dust they left behind lingered for only a few moments before the wind scattered it across the prairie, as though the land itself had grown tired of remembering his name. Peace returned slowly, not suddenly, like sunlight creeping across an old wooden floor. Naya stood beside Ash, resting her forehead gently against his neck. The gray horse closed his eyes for a moment, breathing softly through his nostrils. Ethan watched without interrupting. There are reunions that belong to witnesses, and there are others that belong only to silence. After several minutes, Naya untied the braided leather charm once again. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned toward Ethan. My husband always said this braid would stay with the person who protected the future, not the past. She held it out. I want you to keep it. Ethan did not reach for it immediately. It belongs to your family. It belongs to the one who chose kindness before knowing its value. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes carried years of gratitude she had never expected to express. Slowly, Ethan accepted the braid. The feather stirred gently in the morning breeze. Not because of luck, because of trust. Ash lifted his head and walked toward Ethan without being called. He pressed his broad forehead against the rancher's shoulder exactly as he had done on the day they first met. There was no rope between them, no command, no reward, only choice. The old blacksmith smiled beneath his white beard. I've worked around horses for 50 years. Everyone looked toward him. I've never seen one answer a man's heart before he answered his hands. No one argued. There was nothing left to prove. The sheriff climbed back into his saddle and tipped his hat toward Naya. I believe this valley deserves its real name again. She looked at him with quiet surprise. It always had one. What was it? She glanced across the distant meadow where generations of horses had once run beneath open skies. Our people called it the Valley of Returning Hooves. The old blacksmith nodded slowly. Seems fitting. Ash suddenly trotted a few yards into the pasture before stopping. He looked first toward the hidden valley beyond the hills, then back toward Ethan and Naya. His ears stood forward, waiting, not choosing between them, inviting them both. Without speaking, Ethan picked up his saddle. Naya gathered the reins of her mare. Together they walked toward the gray horse waiting beneath the widening morning sky, where old bloodlines, old wounds, and old divisions no longer seemed nearly as important as the quiet road stretching ahead. Legacies are seldom written in courthouse ledgers or carved into expensive monuments. More often they are carried quietly through generations by those who refuse to let kindness disappear. Autumn arrived gently across the valley, painting the cottonwoods with gold and setting long ribbons of amber grass dancing beneath cool western winds. Months had passed since the morning Barrett rode away in silence. The investigation uncovered forged property claims, stolen breeding records, and years of quiet intimidation that had frightened honest families into surrendering land they never should have lost. Barrett's influence faded not because someone defeated him with violence, but because the truth finally found enough voices willing to repeat it. His vast ranch was divided to satisfy old debts, while the hidden valley was officially restored under its original name, the Valley of Returning Hooves. For the first time in decades, neighbors who had once crossed the road rather than greet an Apache widow now tipped their hats when Naya rode into town. Nothing about her had changed except the way people chose to see her. Ethan never spoke about himself whenever strangers praised what had happened. If someone thanked him for saving the horse, he quietly answered that Ash had probably saved him instead. Together, Ethan and Naya rebuilt the old cedar corrals one weathered board at a time. The elderly blacksmith repaired rusted branding irons, though they were never used to claim ownership again. Instead, they became reminders of history, hanging beneath the stable roof where every visitor could see them. Young ranchers began arriving from neighboring counties to learn about endurance bloodlines, careful breeding, and the patient partnership between horse and rider. Naya taught them that strength without gentleness always ended too soon. Ethan showed them that a horse first watched a man's character before trusting his hands. Ash grew older, but his stride never lost its quiet confidence. Every spring, he led the first foals into the open meadow, and every autumn, he stood patiently while children brushed his silver coat beneath the cottonwood trees. None of those children cared whether the woman beside him was Apache or whether the rancher beside her came from a different world. They only saw two good people smiling at the same horse. One cool evening, as the sun settled behind distant mesas and painted the sky with deep shades of crimson and bronze, Ethan found the braided leather charm resting on the old fence where he had left it after repairing a broken gate. He picked it up carefully and walked toward Naya, intending to return it once again. She looked at the braid, then gently closed his hand around it without a word. Some gifts stopped belonging to families and started belonging to stories. Ethan understood. He slipped the braid beneath Ash's mane exactly where it had rested on the day they first met. The gray horse raised his head toward the fading light, ears forward, breathing the cool evening air as though listening to voices carried by the wind across generations. Far beyond the valley, travelers would eventually hear a tale about a cowboy who came looking for a horse and found an entire forgotten history instead. Some versions would grow larger with time. Others would leave details behind. But every honest telling ended the same way. Justice had arrived without a gunshot. A widow had regained her dignity without demanding revenge. A horse had chosen compassion over fear. And somewhere beneath an endless western sky, where dust settled more quickly than hatred and silence often carried more truth than speeches, the sound of returning hooves continued to echo softly through the valley, reminding anyone willing to listen that the greatest inheritance a person could leave behind was never land, wealth, or power, but the quiet courage to recognize another human being's worth before the rest of the world finally learned to do the same.